I worked for 35 years with grease under my fingernails and a constant ache in my lower back, all to build something I thought would last forever. My name is Arthur, and I own Miller's Auto and Body. It wasn't just a shop, it was the heartbeat of our small town. I started it with a single floor jack and a toolbox I bought at a yard sale. By the time I turned 60, I had 4 bays, a loyal crew of mechanics who were like brothers to me, and a reputation that you couldn't buy with any amount of marketing. People brought their cars to me because they knew I'd tell them the truth. If it didn't need fixing, I didn't fix it. That kind of honesty built me a comfortable life, a nice house on 3 acres of land, and a college fund for my only son, Leo. I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was teaching him the value of a hard day's work and the importance of a man's word. But Leo didn't want a life of grease and manual labor. He wanted the high-rise offices and the expensive suits he saw in the movies. He wanted to be an investment strategist, which I eventually realized was just a fancy term for moving other people's money around and taking a cut. I was proud of him at first. When he moved to the city and started making more money in a month than I made in a year, I thought I had succeeded as a father. I didn't care that he never came home for the holidays or that he stopped answering my calls unless he needed something. I just figured he was busy building his own empire. Then, 2 years ago, the economy took a turn, and the strategies Leo was so proud of started to crumble. He came home one night, unannounced, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He told me he was in trouble. He said he'd made some bad moves with a client's money and that if he didn't cover the gap, he was going to prison. He sat at my kitchen table, crying like the little boy who used to be afraid of the dark, and begged me to help him. He told me he just needed a signature. He said he had a plan to save his firm, but he needed collateral to secure a bridge loan. He suggested I sign over the deed to the shop and the land just for 90 days. He swore on his mother's grave that it was just a formality, that the loan would be paid off before the first interest payment was even due. I should have known better. I should have seen the way his eyes darted around the room, or noticed that the paperwork he brought was 50 pages long and written in legal language I couldn't understand. But he was my son. I loved him. I picked up the pen and I signed away 35 years of my life in less than 10 seconds. I thought I was saving him. I thought I was being a hero. Instead, I was just handing him the knife he was going to use to gut me. 2 weeks later, I showed up to work on a Monday morning to find a chain on the gate and a notice from a property development company pinned to the fence. The shop had been sold, not used as collateral for a loan, but sold outright to a firm that specialized in clearing dilapidated properties for shopping centers. I tried to call Leo, but his phone was disconnected. I went to his apartment in the city, but the doorman told me he had moved out in the middle of the night. My own son had tricked me into signing a quitclaim deed, sold the land behind my back, and vanished with the cash, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a mortgage on a house I no longer owned. I spent the next 6 months living in a cheap, $40 a night motel on the outskirts of town. Every morning, I'd sit on the edge of the bed and look at my hands that were stained with decades of oil that would never come out, and I'd wonder how a man could do that to his own flesh and blood. The bank took the house. My crew at the shop lost their jobs. The town looked at me with pity, which was worse than if they'd looked at me with hate. I was the old fool who got played by his own kid. I saw Leo on the news once, about 4 months into my stay at the motel. He was in a neighboring state, standing next to a beautiful woman at a gala, talking about a new venture he was launching. He looked happy. He looked rich. He didn't look like a man who had left his father to rot in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. That was the moment something inside me shifted. The sadness didn't go away, but it got pushed down by a cold, hard lump of reality. I wasn't just going to sit here and wait to die. If Leo wanted to play the high-stakes game of business and betrayal, I was going to show him that I knew more about how the world actually worked than he ever would. I started by doing what I do best. I looked under the hood. I spent my days at the local library, using their computers to look into the development company that bought my land. I found out they weren't just some big corporate giant. They were a shell company, a group of investors who specialized in fast-track projects where they cut corners to save money. And then I remembered something. Back in the late 70s, before I bought the lot for the garage, it used to be a storage site for an old chemical manufacturing plant. There were records of underground storage tanks that had been decommissioned, but I knew for a fact they were still there. I'd hit one of them with a backhoe back in '92 when I was trying to expand the office, and I'd spent a fortune quietly sealing it up and building over it. In my world, you dealt with things yourself. I never reported it because I didn't want the state shutting me down, and I'd kept it safe for 30 years. But the developers, they hadn't done a proper environmental survey. They were in such a hurry to build their mall that they'd just taken Leo's word that the land was clean. I knew exactly what was going to happen once they started digging for the foundation. If those tanks were ruptured without the proper containment, it wouldn't just be a leak. It would be a multi-million-dollar environmental disaster that would shut down the project for years and lead to massive fines. I also knew that Leo had signed an indemnity clause. I'd seen it in the fine print of the papers I eventually got from a lawyer. It meant that if any undisclosed environmental issues popped up, the seller, Leo, was personally liable for the costs. He thought he was being clever by selling clean land at a premium. He thought he'd escaped, but he was sitting on a ticking time bomb, and I was the only one who knew where the fuse was. I didn't go to the EPA. I didn't go to the news. Not yet. I had to make sure the trap was set perfectly. I reached out to an old friend of mine, a guy named Sal who used to work for the county building inspector's office. Sal was retired now, and he had a grudge against the city council for pushing him out. I told him what was happening, and I told him I needed to see the blueprints for the new mall. We met in a booth at a Greasy Spoon diner, and as we looked over the plans, a slow smile spread across my face. They were planning to put the main support pillars for the parking garage right on top of the old tank site. If they drove those pilings into the ground, they were going to pierce the rusted metal and dump thousands of gallons of toxic sludge directly into the town's water table. It was the brutal part of the revenge I was planning, but I knew I could control it. I wasn't going to let them poison the town. I was going to make sure the leak was discovered the second they broke ground, at the exact moment when the legal and financial pressure on Leo would be at its maximum. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. I'll love to hear. The day the construction crew moved in was a Tuesday. I sat in my rusted old truck across the street, watching as the bulldozers tore down the walls of my shop. It hurt to see it, seeing the place where I'd spent my life turned into a pile of rubble. But I kept my eyes on the back corner of the lot, where the hot zone was. I'd sent an anonymous tip to the lead contractor's insurance company the night before, telling them that the site hadn't been properly surveyed for hazardous waste. I knew how those insurance guys worked. They don't take risks. They were going to send a private inspector out that morning to verify the claims before the heavy digging started. I watched as a white SUV pulled up to the site. A man in a hard hat and a safety vest got out, carrying a soil sampling kit. He talked to the foreman for a minute, and I could see the foreman gesturing angrily toward the machines. They were behind schedule, and they didn't want to delay. But the inspector wasn't budging. He walked over to the back lot, right where I'd marked the spot on my mind. He started taking samples. About an hour later, I saw him stop. He pulled something out of the ground, looked at it, and immediately pulled out his radio. Within 10 minutes, every machine on that site had come to a halt. The foreman was pacing around, screaming into his phone. I knew who he was calling. He was calling the development firm, and the development firm was going to be calling Leo. I didn't wait around for the fallout. I went back to the motel and waited for my phone to ring. I knew he'd call eventually. He'd be desperate again, and he'd realize that I was the only person who knew the history of that land. Sure enough, at 7 p.m., my phone buzzed. I let it ring. He called back 3 more times. Finally, on the 4th try, I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Dad, are you there? Leo's voice was shaking. The cocky, high-flying investor was gone. He sounded like a man who was watching his life catch fire. They stopped the project. They found something in the soil, some kind of chemicals. They're saying the fines could be in the millions, and the developer is suing me for fraud because I signed the disclosure saying the land was clear. Dad, you have to tell me what's down there. You have to tell me how to fix it. I don't have to do anything, Leo, I said. My voice was as cold and steady as a torque wrench. The shop is gone. My house is gone. My life is gone. You sold it all for a paycheck. Now you can use that paycheck to pay the lawyers and the EPA. I hope the gala was worth it. Dad, please. I'm going to lose everything. They're going to take my firm, my car, my apartment. I'll be in debt for the rest of my life. I'm your son. A son doesn't leave his father in a $40 motel while he drinks champagne. I said, you made a business decision, Leo. Now I'm making one. I've already sent the original 92 repair records to the developer's legal team. They know you knew. Or at least, they know the records were in the shop office that you cleared out. That makes it criminal fraud, not just a civil mistake. You aren't just going to be broke, Leo. You're going to be in an orange jumpsuit. I hung up the phone. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace you get from a job well done. It was the kind of peace you get when you finally cut out a cancer. But the revenge wasn't finished. I wasn't just going to watch him go to jail. I was going to take back what was mine, piece by piece, and I was going to make sure he watched me do it. I spent the next few weeks working with Sal and a couple of my old mechanic buddies. We found a way to buy back the equipment that had been auctioned off. We found a small lot just down the road from the old site. It was a dump, an old gas station that had been closed for 20 years, but it was cheap and it was mine. While Leo was being dragged through depositions and legal hearings, I was back in the grease. My hands were black again, my back was aching, but the air in the new shop felt clean. The town started coming back. They didn't come because they pitied me anymore. They came because they knew that Arthur Miller was back, and they knew that if you wanted your car fixed right, you went to the man who had survived the fire. I watched the news reports of Leo's trial. He looked small. He looked broken. He tried to blame me, tried to say I'd misled him, but the records I'd found and sent to the court were undeniable. He was convicted of multiple counts of fraud and environmental negligence. The day he was sentenced, I didn't go to the courthouse. I was under the hood of a '68 Mustang, listening to the engine hum. I bought back the 3 acres of land where my house used to be. The development firm had gone bankrupt after the environmental scandal, and the bank was happy to sell it back to me for a fraction of what it was worth. I was going to build a new house, a smaller one that was just for me. Leo was sentenced to 7 years. He sent me a letter from prison a month later, begging for forgiveness, asking me to visit him. I didn't open it. I just put it in the small metal trash can I kept for oily rags and dropped a match in. I watched the paper turn to ash, the smoke rising up into the clear blue sky. I'm 61 now, and I have grease under my fingernails again. My son is in a cell. His empire is a pile of legal documents and debt, and the land he tried to steal is back where it belongs. It's a realistic story because it doesn't have a happy ending where we all hug and forget the past. The past is like oil. Once it's in the dirt, it stays there. You just have to decide if you're going to let it poison you, or if you're going to use it to fuel the fire that brings you back to life. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this. And drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. I'll love to hear.